You're watching a 14-year-old girl being dragged out of the emperor's room. She's not walking. Two servants are pulling her by the arms. Her feet drag across the marble floor. Her eyes are open, but there's no one inside anymore. 3 days ago, that girl was laughing in the room next to yours. This morning, they called her. Now, she's something else, like someone pulled her soul out. A servant sees you watching. She grabs your arm, pulls you back into your room. Don't look, never look. And when they come for you, don't fight. Rome, year 39 AD. You're 14 years old. You've been locked in a place called the Garden of Venus for 6 days, and you just learned what happens to girls when they get summoned. Your dad said this was a privilege. Your mom cried when you got on the carriage. The neighbors watched with envy as you rode up the hill toward the palace. No one told you the truth. No one told you that the most powerful man in the world has a system like a factory that writes down girls' names on tablets, their ages, what they look like, and calls them one by one to his room. And when they come out, they're not the same anymore. This is the story of what Caligula did to the girls in his palace. And the scariest part isn't what music he did. It's that no one stopped him. Not the senators, not the music guards, not even the parents who handed their daughters over at the door. Everyone knew and everyone stayed quiet. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. It takes a second and helps us pull more voices out of the silence. But before you understand what happened in those rooms, you need to understand how a human being becomes capable of this. Because Caligula wasn't born a monster, he was manufactured. The year is 19 AD. A 7-year-old boy runs through a Roman military camp wearing a miniature soldier's uniform complete with tiny armor and little red boots. The soldiers adore him. They call him Caligula, Little Boots. He's the son of Germanicus, Rome's greatest general, since Julius Caesar. The men believe this child brings them victory. He has no idea what's coming. 1 year later, his father dies. The official story, sudden illness. The whispered story, poison, ordered by Emperor Tiberius himself. Caligula is 8 years old when the machine starts destroying his family. His mother dragged from their home, accused of treason, starved to death in exile. His oldest brother, arrested. Music imprisoned. So hungry he tried to eat the stuffing from his mattress. His second brother, exiled to an island where guards tortured him until he smashed his own head against the walls to end it. One by one, erased, and young Caligula watches all of it happen. By 31 AD, he's the last one left, 19 years old, the sole survivor. Then comes the summons. Emperor Tiberius wants to see him on Capri. The ancient historians Suetonius, Tacitus, people writing within living memory of these events, describe Capri as a house of horrors. Tiberius had turned the island into music, his personal fortress, far from Rome, far from anyone who might object to what he did there. Into this environment walks teenage Caligula. He knows Tiberius murdered his family. Everyone knows, but he can't show it. One wrong look, one flash of anger, and he's dead. Suetonius writes something chilling. There never was a better servant or a worse master. For 6 years, Caligula watches, studies, learns exactly how to break human beings from the greatest monster music in Roman history. Then in 37 AD, Tiberius dies. Some say natural causes. Others say Caligula smothered him with a pillow. Either way, the hostage is now emperor. Rome celebrates. They think they're getting the son of beloved Germanicus. They have no idea what they just unleashed. For 7 months, everything seems perfect. Caligula releases prisoners, hosts spectacular games, distributes money to the people. Then he gets sick, a severe fever that lasts weeks. The person who wakes up is not the same person who went to sleep. What happened during those fevered days we'll never know. But when Caligula recovered, something inside him had shattered, and Rome was about to learn what he'd been hiding. Imperial officials begin traveling through Rome and the surrounding territories. They visit houses of wealthy families and poor families alike. They're not looking for soldiers. They're not recruiting talent. They're looking for 3 things: age, beauty, purity, girls between 12 and 16 years old, faces that please the emperor, and virgins verified by family reputation and sometimes examined. Suetonius, writing decades later, describes this process in fragments. He mentions young women of noble families brought to the palace. He notes that Caligula inspected them personally as a slave dealer examines merchandise before purchase, Even Suetonius, a man who documented orgies, murders, and incest without flinching, seems uncomfortable describing what came next. Records were kept. Wax tablets documented each girl's name, age, physical appearance, family connections. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was inventory management. Human beings reduced to entries in an accounting ledger. The system was terrifyingly efficient. Officials traveled in pairs carrying imperial seals that opened any door. They had quotas to meet, reports to file. They measured their success in numbers: how many candidates identified, music, how many families visited, how many girls delivered. This wasn't chaos, this was bureaucracy. And that's what makes it truly horrifying. Not one madman acting on impulse, but dozens of functionaries processing human beings, with the same detachment they'd use to count grain shipments. The families didn't resist. In a society where honor was everything, being selected by the emperor was presented as the highest privilege. Parents competed for the opportunity, dressed their daughters in white, braided their hair with flowers. Some mothers wept, mothers when the carriage departed, but they wept quietly because crying loudly would mean they weren't happy, and not music being happy would mean serving the emperor was something bad. So they swallowed their tears, swallowed their doubts, and let their daughters go. They called it the Garden of Venus. The name sounds beautiful, romantic, like a place filled with flowers and fountains, where young women learned poetry and music. It was a prison. But here's what made it worse than any dungeon. A dungeon looks like a dungeon. Chains, cold stone. You know where you stand. This place looked like paradise. Silk curtains everywhere, beds softer than anything these girls had ever touched, perfume thick enough to taste, food most Romans never knew existed, servants who smiled and fulfilled every request, everything beautiful, everything wrong. Modern psychologists have a term for what this does to the human mind: cognitive dissonance. When your senses tell you one thing and your instincts tell you another, your brain starts to crack. You can't trust your own perceptions anymore. The girls couldn't leave their rooms without permission, couldn't contact their families, didn't know what day it was, didn't know what they were supposed to do. They just waited, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. No one explained anything. No one told them when they'd be called. No one told them what happened, when they were. They only heard footsteps at night, passing their doors, stopping at another door, a girl being taken, and the next morning that girl would be different, quieter, emptier, or she wouldn't come back at all. The servants who brought food watched everything. Every tear got reported. Every whisper between girls got documented. If two girls started forming a friendship, finding comfort in shared suffering, they'd be separated, moved to different wings. Because connection breeds strength, music and strength breeds resistance. Isolation was part of the design. The waiting itself was the torture. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted experiments that revealed something disturbing about the mind. When subjects learned that nothing they did could change their situation, they stopped trying. They gave up. Not from weakness, but because their brains were trying to protect them from madness. He called it learned helplessness. First you fight, then you realize fighting doesn't work. Then you stop fighting, then you stop feeling. The girls in the Garden of Venus were being systematically broken. Not through violence, not yet, but through luxury that felt wrong, kindness that hid cruelty, and uncertainty that never ended. By the time Caligula called for them, most had already surrendered. That was the point. We're about to reveal music, how Caligula used these girls to control all of Rome. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story matters. Subscribe, because Crown and Dagger doesn't hide from history's darkest chapters. But Caligula wasn't satisfied with just the girls. He wanted to break everyone. The historian Cassius Dio describes imperial banquets that became theaters of systematic humiliation. Marble halls filled with Rome's most powerful men, senators, generals, governors, eating and drinking and pretending everything was normal. Then Caligula would stand, walk between the tables, examine the wives of his guests, the way he examined the girls in his garden. He would select one, take her hand, music lead her away, and her husband would sit there, do nothing, say nothing. What could he do? Object. His children would be dead by morning, his entire family erased from Roman history. So he sat, drank his wine, made small talk with the man beside him who was pretending not to hear anything. Waited. 20 minutes passed, 30. The conversation around him was forced, brittle. Everyone pretending this was normal. Music, everyone pretending they couldn't hear the sounds from the other room. Cassius Dio recorded one specific incident. A senator named 5A. Larius Asiaticus watched as Caligula took his wife. When she was returned, Caligula sat down and began describing in graphic detail exactly what had happened. He rated her performance, compared her to other senators' wives, made jokes. Asiaticus had to smile, had to nod, had to thank him. Some humiliations you don't forget. 3 years later, Asiaticus was one of the conspirators who helped plan Caligula's assassination. But here's what made the banquet truly evil. It wasn't just about the women. Music, it was about complicity. Once you sat at that table and did nothing while the emperor violated someone's wife, you were guilty too. You couldn't expose him without exposing yourself. You couldn't rebel because you were already part of the machine. Suetonius writes that Caligula would sometimes loan the palace girls to favored senators, not as gifts, as traps. Accept the loan and you've participated, refuse, and you've insulted the emperor. Either choice, music destroys you. That's how tyranny actually works. Not through armies and laws alone, through shame, through complicity, through making everyone so dirty that no one can point fingers. The senators who attended those banquets went home to their families, kissed their children good night, pretended they were still honorable men, but they knew, and Caligula knew they knew. And that knowledge was its own kind of chain. Every machine has a flaw. Music, while Caligula was busy breaking senators and destroying young girls, he made a critical mistake. He forgot about the guards. The Taurian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, elite soldiers who stood inches from him every single day, armed, trained, lethal. One of them was named Cassius Chaerea, senior officer, respected veteran, a man who had served Rome with honor for decades. Chaerea had one physical characteristic that Caligula found endlessly amusing: a high-pitched voice. Every day new jokes, new mockery in front of everyone. When Chaerea had to ask for the daily military password, a standard protocol, Caligula would assign him words like Venus or kiss me. Feminine words, humiliating words. The other soldiers would smirk day after day, month after month. Suetonius notes that Caligula thought this was hilarious, thought Chaerea would swallow it like everyone else. He miscalculated. Senators had families to protect. They could rationalize staying quiet. But Chaerea was a soldier, a man trained to solve problems with a blade, a man who stood next to the emperor every day with a sword on his hip. And Caligula had just taught him that life under this emperor wasn't worth living. January 24th, 41 AD. Caligula walks through an underground corridor beneath the theatre. Narrow, dimly lit stone walls on both sides. He's in a good mood, looking forward to a performance. Chaerea is waiting in the shadows. The details come from multiple sources. Music. When Caligula approached, Chaerea stepped forward. Standard protocol. Guards always checked in with Emperor. He asked for the daily password. Caligula smirked, opened his mouth to deliver another humiliation. One last joke at Chaerea's expense. He never finished the sentence. Chaerea screamed, "Take this," and drove his sword up under Caligula's ribs. The corridor was too narrow to escape. Conspirators at both ends. They swarmed him. 30 stab wounds. They didn't stop until nothing remained that could possibly be alive. 4 years of accumulated terror. 4 years of humiliation. 4 years of watching girls destroyed, and senators broken, released in 60 seconds of frenzied violence. But they weren't finished. They found Caligula's wife, killed her. Then they found the nursery, his daughter, 2 years old. A soldier grabbed the child and slammed her head against a marble wall. No heirs, no revenge. The bloodline ends here. The machine had consumed its creator. The new emperor, Music Claudius, faced an impossible problem. What do you do with the girls still locked in the Garden of Venus? If he acknowledges what happened, the entire empire learns Rome's shame. Families demand justice. Senators who participated get exposed. Music, the system unravels. So he chose silence. The girls were sent home quietly with gifts. Gold, silk, jewels, not compensation. Bribes, payment for amnesia. Most families took the deal. What choice did they have? Their daughter was damaged. Goods. No one would marry her now. The best they could hope for was silence. Pretend it never happened. But the GRLs didn't forget. How do you forget something like that? How do you go back to normal life after what they experienced? According to fragments preserved by later writers, some never let anyone touch them again, flinched at footsteps, couldn't sleep without a lamp burning. Some woke screaming from nightmares for decades, their families learning to pretend they didn't hear. Some simply stopped speaking entirely, sat by windows for hours, stared at walls, lost in memories they couldn't escape and couldn't share. The Greek physician Galen, writing a century later, described symptoms he'd observed in women who'd survived traumatic captivity: loss of speech, inability to eat, a deadness behind the eyes. He didn't connect it to the Garden of Venus. Maybe he didn't know, maybe he knew and couldn't say, but the symptoms match perfectly. One woman, according to a fragment found centuries later, didn't speak about the palace for 50 years of silence. Then on her deathbed she told her granddaughter everything. The granddaughter wrote it down, then burned most of it, but pieces survived, copied by monks who didn't understand what they were preserving, hidden in monastery libraries for centuries. And those fragments are how we know any of this happened. Claudius ordered most of Caligula's records destroyed. The ledgers, the tablets, the documentation of the machine burned. The official histories we have today were written decades later. Suetonius, Tacitus, Casius, Dio work. From memories, rumors, and surviving fragments, which means what you just heard is only what survived the purge. Imagine what was lost. Imagine what was so disturbing that even Romans who watched people die in arenas decided it needed to be erased. The Garden of Venus is gone now, buried under centuries of construction. Archaeologists have found fragments, a mosaic here, a perfume bottle there, but the rooms themselves destroyed, forgotten. Rome wanted to forget, but you can't erase everything. You can burn documents, silence witnesses, rewrite histories, but you can't erase what people carry inside them. You can't kill what gets carved into memory. You can't destroy the fragments that survivors hide in places no one thinks to look. The girl from the beginning of this story, the one being dragged out of the emperor's room, she was real. We don't know her name. History didn't bother recording it. She was just a number on a wax tablet, a piece of inventory that got used and discarded. But she existed. She had dreams. She had a family. She had a whole life ahead of her before they knocked on her door, and someone somewhere loved music her. That's what empires do. They turn people into numbers. They turn lives into inventory. They build systems, music so efficient that no one person feels responsible. The officials were just following orders. The guards were just doing their jobs. The senators were just protecting their families. The parents were just accepting an honor. Everyone had an excuse, and the machine kept running. The only thing that stopped Caligula wasn't morality, wasn't justice, wasn't the Roman people rising up in outrage. It was one soldier who got humiliated one too many times. If Cherry had been a little more patient, a little more afraid, the machine would have kept running. How long? We'll never know. Music, and that's the lesson that echoes across 2,000 years. Systems of cruelty don't fall because they're evil, they fall by accident. By one person breaking at the right moment. The rest of the time they just keep running, consuming lives, creating silence, waiting for someone to finally say, enough. The Garden of Venus operated for 4 years. 4 years of girls being processed like inventory, 4 years of senators being broken at banquets, 4 years of parents handing over daughters and telling themselves it was an honor. And if one soldier hadn't been mocked one too many times, it could have been 40 years, 400. The machine doesn't care how long it runs. It just runs. That's why these stories matter. Not because they're ancient history, not because they're safely in the past, because they're music patterns, templates, blueprints that get used again and again, different faces, different places, same machine. And the only thing that stops it, has ever stopped it, is someone who refuses to stay quiet. This is Hungry Historians. We don't sanitize history. We show you what actually happened. Because the past isn't D-E'd. Music. It's waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to...
April 14,057, a banquet hall in Wakia. 200 noble women sit beside their husbands, dressed in silk, drinking wine, celebrating music, Easter. By sunrise, their husbands will be dead, impaled in the courtyard. And these women, these daughters of aristocrats' music, who had never touched dirt in their lives, will begin a death march to the mountains. One of them was named Voicer, 23 years old, married for 2 years. Her hands had never held anything heavier than a wine cup. Within a week, those hands would be raw meat, nails torn off, bones visible through the skin, dragging stones up a cliff to build a castle for the man who murdered her husband. She worked until the clothes rotted off her body, until there was nothing left to cover her, until she couldn't tell her own blood from the rocks she carried. Voicer was one of 200. Most of them died on that mountain. And this was just the beginning. What Vlad Dracula did to women was not a side effect of war. It was the strategy. It was the message. It was the point. He impaled mothers next to their daughters. He had wives flayed for failing to sew a proper shirt. He turned female bodies into warnings so horrifying that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the man who conquered Constantinople, took one look and turned his army around. Hollywood gave you a vampire who seduces women in castles. History gave you a monster who destroyed them in public squares. This is what really happened. Not to Vlad, to them. To the women history decided you should never know about. History remembers the monster. It forgets the victims. That's what we're here to fix. This is Crown and Dagger. If you want to support the channel, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let me show you where this darkness came from, and why Vlad believed that destroying women was the key to absolute power. But where did this come from? Why women? Vlad spent 6 years as a child hostage in the Ottoman Empire. He watched, he learned. Terror was a tool. Bodies were messages. And the fastest way to break a society was to break its women. When he returned to Wallachia, his father was dead. His older brother had been tortured and buried alive, betrayed by the very nobles they trusted. The boy who left was gone. What came back was something else. A man who believed controlling women meant controlling everything, and punishing women meant sending messages no one could ignore. So that's exactly what he did, starting with the wives of the men who killed his family. Easter Sunday, 457. T.G. Dole. The noble families of Wallachia have gathered at Vlad's palace for a feast, boyas in their finest robes, their wives glittering with jewels, their families filling the halls with laughter. They think this is a celebration. They're wrong. During the banquet, Vlad stands and asks one question: how many princes have you known in your lifetime? Nervous laughter. Even the youngest noble has seen 7 rulers come and go. The oldest has witnessed 30, each one betrayed, each one murdered, each one replaced by another puppet. Vlad nods. Slowly. That is the problem. The doors slam shut. Guards pour in. Within minutes, the old boyars are dragged outside and impaled in the courtyard. The screams echo through the stone walls. Vor hears her father-in-law begging for mercy. Then silence. But for the young nobles and their families, Vlad has different plans. Still wearing their Easter silk, the wives and daughters are chained together. Vor feels the iron close around her wrists so tight it cuts skin. Her guard shoves her forward. Music, she falls. The woman beside her helps her up. Before they march, Vlad makes them watch, their husbands raised on stakes in the courtyard. Some die quickly, some don't. Voicer finds her husband in the forest of bodies. He's still alive, still calling her name. She can't go to him. She can't look away. Then the march begins. 50 meters north, through forests, through mud, through rain, no food, no rest. Women who had traveled their whole lives in carriages now stumble barefoot over rocks. Some collapse on the first day. The guards don't stop. They drag them. When dragging becomes too slow, they leave them behind. The wolves do the rest. When they finally reach the ruins of Poinari Castle, Vlad is waiting. You will rebuild this fortress, music with your hands, according to the Canacusino Chronicle. They worked for months. The silk dresses went first, torn by stone, soaked with blood, rotted by rain, then the undergarments. Soon there was nothing left on their bodies. 200 noble women exposed to the sun, cold, carrying rocks up a mountain with their bare hands. Boyar's hands split open on the 3rd day. By the 2nd week, she couldn't feel them anymore. The woman beside her, a countess who had never lifted anything heavier than embroidery, fell from the cliff on day 12. Her body tumbled down the rocks. No one was allowed to stop. No one was allowed to look. At night they slept on bare stone. No blankets, no shelter, huddled together for warmth like animals. The mountain cold cut through their broken bodies. Some women didn't wake up. Their bodies were dragged aside and the work continued. They ate what the guards threw at them. Scraps, bones with bits of meat still clinging to them, water from puddles. Women who once had servants to pour their wine now fought over muddy rainwater. The chronicle says many died from exhaustion, others fell from the cliffs. Some simply sat down on the stones and refused to move until the guards beat them to death. A few tried to escape. They were caught within hours and impaled in front of the others, a reminder that death was not an escape Vlad would grant easily, and Vlad watched from above. When the castle was finally finished, only a handful of women remained alive. They were kept as servants in the very fortress they had built with their bleeding hands, their noble titles erased, their families gone. They would spend whatever remained of their lives climbing the same stairs that had destroyed them. But here's what makes this worse. Poenari wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about justice. It was about theater. Vlad wanted every noble family in Wallachia to know what happened to the women of his enemies. He wanted wives to look at their husbands and wonder if he falls from favor. Will I be next? The noble women of Poenari weren't just victims. Music, they were a message, and the message was received. But Vlad wasn't finished with the women of his own kingdom because building a castle was punishment for the wives of traitors. For ordinary women, the rules were even more terrifying. If you were a woman in Wallachia between 1456 and 1462, you lived in constant terror, not of war, not of disease, of being noticed. Vlad believed women were the foundation of society. A wife who failed her husband was a crack in that foundation, and cracks had to be sealed with blood. There's a story in the German pamphlets from the time. A peasant man walked through a village wearing a shirt that was too short. His legs were visible. In Vlad's Wallachia, this was not just embarrassing, it was evidence. Vlad stopped him on the road. "Do you have a wife?" The man said, "Yes, bring her to me." She came. A woman named Alinka, strong hands. She had probably spent her whole life working, cooking, cleaning, raising children, sewing when there was time. Vlad looked at her with the same expression he used for inspecting cattle. "Why does your husband walk around dressed like a beggar? Is there no flax in your home? Are your hands broken?" She tried to explain. The children needed care. The farm needed work. There wasn't enough time. There was never enough time. Vlad's response was immediate. What they did to her lasted hours. The village was forced to watch. When it was over, what remained of her was raised on a stake in the square. Her body left there for days, a warning no one could ignore. Then Vlad found another woman for the widowed peasant. He looked at her and spoke, slowly so everyone in the village could hear. "Make sure his shirt is longer or you'll share her fate." This was the law in Vlad's Wallachia, not written in books, written on bodies. Adulterous wives were flayed in front of their families, their husbands' music forced to watch. Widows who remarried too quickly were impaled, their bodies displayed at crossroads. Women who failed to meet his standards faced punishments the chronicles refused to describe in detail. One account describes a woman accused of being unfaithful. Vlad ordered her taken to the square. What they did to her body, music, took hours. The crowd was forced to watch. When it was over, what remained was raised on a stake as a warning. The message was absolute. Your body does not belong to you. It belongs to your husband, to your family, to the prince. Fail any of them and the punishment will be beyond music imagination. Women stopped leaving their homes unless necessary. Wives checked their husbands' clothing obsessively, terrified of a loose thread or a short hem. Mothers taught daughters that survival meant one thing: be invisible. This was not the reign of a vampire. This was the reign of a man who understood that the fastest way to control a population was to terrorize its women. Was Vlad a product of his brutal times or something worse? Tell me what you think in the comments. But before you decide, let me show you what he did to the women of his enemies. Winter Music, 1462. Vlad has crushed the boyars. His own people are frozen with fear. Now he turns south toward the Ottoman Empire. This isn't a war of conquest. Vlad doesn't have the army for that. This is a war of messages, and he's going to write those messages on the bodies of the innocent. He crosses the Danube with his troops and moves through Ottoman territory village by village. What he leaves behind is silence. In a letter to King Matthias of Hungary dated February 11, 1462, Vlad wrote with the precision of an accountant, 23:8. 84 Turks and Bulgarians were killed, not counting those burned in their homes or whose heads were not presented to our officers, entire families. No one was spared, but the killing was only the beginning. The survivors were gathered for something special. Picture a Bulgarian village on the Danube. The initial attack is over. The men who resisted music are dead. The survivors, mostly women and their families, are herded into the town square. They expect slavery. Slavery is what conquerors do. Slavery would be mercy. Instead, music, the stakes come out. A mother clutches her daughter. Soldiers grab them both, but they don't separate them. That would be too easy. Vlad wants families to die together. He wants mothers to watch. He wants daughters to hear. The stake isn't sharp. It's rounded, greased with oil. Designed not to kill quickly. Designed to let the body's own weight do the work slowly over hours, sometimes days. The mother watches her daughter raised into the air. She hears sounds that will echo in her skull until her own death, which comes minutes later on the stake beside her. When Ottoman scouts arrived days later, they found what one chronicler called a forest of the impaled. Bodies, arranged by height. Music, the tallest stakes, held the most important captives. Families hung together. That was the point. Some were still alive, their bodies moving slowly in the wind. And this was one village. Vlad did this along the entire Danube. Dozens of villages, thousands of bodies. The river itself was said to be stained for miles. By June 1462, Sultan Mehmed the sect had seen enough. He gathered the largest army in the world, 100,000 men, and he marched toward Wallachia to end Vlad once and for all. But Vlad had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Outside Targovice, the Ottoman army stopped. The soldiers in front began to scream. Some turned and ran, others fell to their knees. The Sultan rode forward to see what had broken his army. In front of him stretched a field nearly a mile long, half a mile wide, and in that field, raised on stakes of varying heights, were 20,000 bodies, entire families together. The Byzantine historian Leonos Chalka Condonder was there. He wrote there were large stakes on which about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. Imagine being one of those women, still alive, feeling your body slowly giving into gravity, watching the largest army in the world arrive, and knowing that even they cannot save you. That your death is not a tragedy to be mourned, but a message to be read. Some bodies had been there for weeks, rotted beyond recognition. Others were fresh, still bleeding. A few were still alive, their bodies twitching in the summer heat. The smell reached the Ottoman army before they could see the field. Soldiers who had conquered cities vomited at the sight. Mehmed, the man who conquered Constantinople, who ended an empire that had lasted 1,000 years, who had walked through more blood than any ruler alive, stared at the field of corpses and made a decision. He turned his army around, and music left. According to Chalka Condesiles, the Sultan said, "It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such great deeds, and who can exploit his kingdom and his music subjects in this way." It wasn't admiration, it was surrender dressed in diplomatic language. Vlad had won, and the price of victory was paid in the bodies of mothers and daughters. The Sultan left. The women stayed on their stakes. Vlad had won. But there was one more woman in this story, the one closest to him, and her ending was the darkest of all. She has no name in the history books. We know her only as Vlad's first wife. Music, spring 1462. The Ottomans have retreated, but Vlad's brother, Radu, is leading a new army toward Panari Castle, the same castle built by the hands of noble women 5 years earlier. Vlad's wife stands on the battlements. Below her, Music, the Argish river, crashes against the rocks. Behind her, the castle her husband built on the bones of women. In front of her, an army carrying Ottoman flags. She knows what happens to captured women, the harems, the slavery, a life of degradation. But she also knows what her own husband does to women. She's lived in his world. She's seen the stakes. She's heard the screams. She's walked the halls of a castle built by women who died carrying stones. She's trapped between two monsters. According to local legend, she turned to her servants and said 7 words. "I would rather be food for the fish of the Argesh than a prisoner of the Turks," and she jumped. Her body fell hundreds of feet into the river below. The water swallowed her without a trace. Today that river is still called Raoul Duam, the Ladies' River. Vlad escaped through a secret passage. He would spend 12 years in a Hungarian prison, marry again, and eventually die in battle in 1476. His head was sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan displayed it on a stake. The man who lived by the stake died by the stake, but his wife had already escaped the only way she could. Vor building a castle until her hands were bones. Ilinka destroyed for a shirt that was too short. Thousands of nameless mothers raised on stakes beside their daughters, and a wife with no name choosing a river over two different kinds of hell. These are the women of Vlad Dracula's reign. Not seduced, music, not bitten, not romanticized, destroyed. Hollywood needed a monster that was sexy, a villain you could secretly root for, a darkness that was thrilling, not disturbing. So they gave you capes and castles and eternal life. The real Dracula offered none of that. He offered stakes and screaming, and women used as parchment for messages written in blood. And here's the uncomfortable truth that history doesn't want to teach you. It worked. For 6 years, a kingdom smaller than some modern cities held off the greatest empire on Earth. Not through diplomacy, not through military genius, through cruelty so absolute, so theatrical, so specifically targeted at women and families that even the Sultan couldn't stomach it. Vlad proved something dark about power, that there is a level of horror so extreme that it becomes its own kind of strength. That the fastest way to music break your enemies is to break the women they love. The question isn't whether Vlad was evil. History is full of men who killed more. The question is why we turned him into a romantic figure, why we gave him a cape and fangs and a castle full of candles, why we made him seductive instead of horrifying, and why we forgot the names of the women he destroyed. Because that's what we do. We remember the monsters. We build legends around them. We write books and make movies and sell merchandise with their faces on it. And the victims, they become statistics, background noise, nameless bodies in a story that was never really about them. Vor deserves to be remembered. Her hands bled so a monster could have a fortress. Her suffering built walls that tourists photograph today. So does Ilinka, who died because a shirt was too short. So do the mothers of the Danube, who held their daughters as the stakes went up. So does the nameless wife who chose the river over a world where women had no choices at all. They didn't choose to be part of this story. They didn't choose to become messages, warnings, examples, but they were. And the least we can do is remember them. If you made it this far, hit subscribe. Today, tourists climb the 1,480 steps to Poinari Castle. They take selfies at the top. They buy Dracula t-shirts in the gift shops. They post photos with captions about vampires in Transylvania. They have no idea they're standing on a mass grave. The stones beneath their feet were carried by Vor, by women whose silk dresses rotted away as they worked, by mothers who watched their daughters fall from cliffs and weren't allowed to stop. Every step up that mountain is a step on someone's suffering. Every photo is taken on someone's grave. Every smile is in a place where women screamed until music they couldn't scream anymore. Hollywood gave you fangs and romance. History gave you stakes and silence. Now you know the difference. But Vlad wasn't the only ruler who understood the power of cruelty against women. There was an empire that perfected this horror centuries before Dracula was born. An empire that made Vlad look almost merciful. What the Mongols did to Baghdad's royal family was a warning to the world. Hashtag the women forgotten by Dracula's legend. Vlad the Impaler, 1456 to 1462, used extreme cruelty not just as punishment, but as psychological warfare, targeting women to break society itself. At Easter, he invited Wallachian nobles to a banquet, then impaled the older boyars and forced their wives and daughters, around 200 aristocratic women in silk gowns, to march 50 miles to Poinari Castle. There, barefoot and dechained, they rebuilt the fortress with their bare hands. Clothes rotted away, hands bled to bone. Many died from exhaustion, falls, or cold. Survivors became servants in the castle they built with their suffering. Vlad punished ordinary women brutally too, flaying a peasant wife for her husband's short shirt, impaling adulteresses or widows who remarried too soon. Female bodies became public warnings. Your body belongs to the state. In 1462, To repel the Ottoman invasion, he impaled thousands along the Danube, arranging mothers beside daughters in forests of stakes. The sight of 20,000 corpses outside Targoviste horrified even Sultan Mehmed II, who withdrew his massive army. His own wife, facing capture, reportedly leapt from Poenari into the river below, preferring death to enslavement or her husband's world. Hollywood romanticized Vlad as a seductive vampire. History shows a ruler who understood that terrorizing women and families could hold off empires. It worked, for 6 years. But the true cost was paid by nameless women, the noble women of Poenari, the villagers on stakes, the wife who chose the river. History remembers the monster. Their stories remind us of power's darkest price.